Welcome. Today we uncover one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in America, the disappearance of Relisha Rudd. In the heart of Washington, D.C. in 2014, a mystery began that remains one of the most disturbing, heartbreaking, and unsolved cases in America. It is the story of a little girl, just 8 years old, who seemed to vanish into thin air. Her name was Relisha Rudd, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance reveal a devastating combination of poverty, systemic neglect, and a chilling series of decisions that left more questions than answers. What happened to Relisha remains an open wound, not only for her family, but for an entire city haunted by her absence. Relisha's story does not begin with her disappearance. It begins with her childhood, a life shaped by instability, hardship, and an environment that was anything but safe. Born into a cycle of poverty, Relisha spent much of her short life moving between unsafe homes and temporary shelters. Her mother, Shamika Young, struggled to provide for her children, and as a result, they often found themselves relying on D.C.'s homeless shelter system. For Relisha, childhood was not filled with the carefree joys many children experience. Instead, she grew up in an environment where survival came before everything else. By the time she was 8, Relisha was already living in the largest homeless shelter in the nation's capital, located inside a former hospital building. The place was massive, housing hundreds of families in cramped temporary units. To outsiders, it was a symbol of the city's attempt to address homelessness. To the residents, it was a harsh, crowded, and sometimes dangerous place. For a young child like Relisha, it was no place to grow up. Neighbors and teachers would later describe Relisha as bright, curious, and sweet. She loved to dress up, play with dolls, and dreamed of a life far beyond the shelter walls. In many ways, she was like any other 8-year-old girl, but she was also vulnerable to her circumstances, to the instability of her home life, and tragically, vulnerable to the predators who would eventually enter her world. At the shelter where Relisha lived, there was a man named Kahlil Tatum. He worked as a janitor there. On the surface, Tatum seemed like an ordinary staff member, someone tasked with cleaning and keeping the facility running. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked darkness. Residents would later describe him as a man who liked to be around children more than he should. He offered them gifts, candy, and money. He seemed to position himself as someone the kids could trust, someone who was kind and generous. For children, growing up in a harsh environment, his attention might have seemed like a small blessing. For parents under stress, it might have looked like a helping hand. But in reality, it was something much more sinister. Relisha's family allowed her to spend time with Tatum. Sometimes she would go with him on outings, trips that were presented as treats, visits to the pool, to the mall, and even overnight stays. While most adults around her saw nothing immediately alarming, others later asked the question, why was a grown man, an employee at a homeless shelter, spending unsupervised time with a little girl who was not his family? Why did no one intervene? These questions hang heavily over the case, unanswered to this day. In early 2014, Relisha's school began to notice troubling patterns. She had been absent frequently, and when staff followed up, her mother explained that she was under the care of a doctor. That doctor, it turned out, was none other than Kahlil Tatum. The lie was convincing enough at first, as Tatum provided written notes excusing her absences. But as the weeks went by, the excuses grew thinner, and suspicions began to rise. By March 2014, Relisha had missed over 30 days of school. Teachers who had grown fond of her became increasingly concerned. The supposed doctor caring for her was never available for contact. The mother seemed evasive, and the little girl they loved seeing in the classroom was simply gone. It was around this time that the first steps were taken to alert authorities, steps that, in hindsight, came far too late. On March 19, 2014, the city's Child and Family Services Agency finally launched an investigation into Relisha's welfare. But by then, she had already been missing for weeks, possibly longer. When authorities began to question Shamika Young about her daughter's whereabouts, her answers were vague. She insisted that Relisha was with Dr. Tatum, receiving care. That statement would soon unravel into a chilling realization. There was no doctor. There was only Kahlil Tatum, the shelter janitor, who had become the last known person to be seen with the little girl. When investigators turned their attention to Tatum, they uncovered a deeply disturbing timeline. Surveillance footage showed Relisha walking with him into a hotel in Northeast D.C. on March 1st, 2014. That footage is the last confirmed sighting of her. She never left the hotel. From that point forward, she simply disappeared. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city. An 8-year-old girl had vanished under the care of a man who should never have been near her in the first place. The city launched a massive search effort. Posters with Relisha's face appeared across D.C., her big brown eyes staring out at a public desperate for answers. Volunteers scoured parks, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas. Police set up tip lines, and news outlets blasted her story across the nation. Yet despite the urgency, the investigation was already trailing behind. Weeks had passed since she was last seen. Every lost day was another day further from finding her alive. As investigators dug deeper into Tatum's background, the picture grew darker. He had a history of violence, including a criminal record that should have raised red flags long before he ever had access to vulnerable families at the shelter. And now, with Relisha missing, his actions became increasingly alarming. Just days after Relisha vanished, Tatum's wife, Andrea, was found shot dead in a hotel room. Police immediately suspected Tatum of the killing. He was now not only the prime suspect in the disappearance of Relisha Rudd, but also a wanted man for murder. The city was in a panic. The search for Relisha and the man believed to have taken her expanded rapidly. But every new discovery only deepened the dread. Tatum was spotted briefly after his wife's murder, but then he too disappeared. Eventually, police would find his body dead from an apparent suicide. He had taken his own life with a gunshot, leaving behind no answers, no clues, and most importantly, no sign of Relisha. And so the central mystery remained. What happened to Relisha Rudd? Was she alive somewhere, hidden away by Tatum or someone else? Or had she become another victim, silenced before she had a chance to grow up? Despite searches, despite the investigation, despite years of questions, no definitive answers have ever been found. Segment 1 of this story ends with that haunting realization. An 8-year-old girl slipped through the cracks of society into the hands of a predator and vanished. As authorities pieced together the timeline, it became increasingly clear that the system had failed her at every possible level. Teachers raised alarms too late. Social services moved too slowly. And the man who should never have had access to her became the last person she was ever seen with. The story of Relisha Rudd is not just about a missing child. It is about the shadows that lurk in plain sight, the predators who take advantage of the vulnerable, and the systems that are supposed to protect but too often fail. It is about a city haunted by a girl who should have been safe, who should have been found, and whose name should not be spoken in whispers of tragedy. But even as the first segment closes, the mystery deepens. Because Relisha's disappearance is not only unsolved, It is entangled in a web of secrecy, silence, and suspicion. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we must go deeper into the investigation, the evidence, and the haunting trail of questions that lead to one of America's most heartbreaking unsolved cases. The disappearance of Relisha Rudd might have begun quietly, hidden within the excuses of a mother and the lies of a predator. But once authorities understood the gravity of the situation, the case exploded into a desperate, citywide search. Relisha was no longer just another child missing too many days of school. She was a little girl who had been last seen with a man who had now become both a suspected kidnapper and a murderer. Washington, D.C. awoke to her face plastered on every news outlet, a school photograph of her hair styled neatly, her expression both innocent and bright, became a haunting symbol of what was at stake. In the photograph, Relisha's eyes seemed to carry both a spark of hope and a quiet sadness, the kind that makes the viewer linger, wondering what she might have been feeling when the picture was taken. That face, framed by posters and news broadcasts, demanded answers. The timeline was already fractured, and investigators struggled to piece it together. They knew Relisha had been seen with Kahlil Tatum on March 1st, 2014, at a Holiday Inn Express hotel in Northeast D.C. Surveillance footage showed her walking beside him, carrying a bag, dressed like a child being taken on a trip. But what happened after they entered that hotel has never been revealed. What was clear was that Relisha was never seen again in public. After that sighting, there were only fragments. Witnesses who thought they had seen her. Rumors whispered among shelter residents. But nothing concrete. As investigators chased leads, the focus shifted to Tatum himself. Who was this man? Why had he gained so much access to vulnerable children? And what had he done with Relisha? Kahlil Tatum was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. He had a long criminal record, including charges of burglary, larceny, and gun possession. He had spent years in and out of prison. His background was checkered with violence and instability, and yet he had been hired at the very shelter where families like Relisha's sought safety. To those who worked alongside him, he was a quiet man, sometimes friendly, sometimes withdrawn, but always keeping his personal life shrouded in secrecy. Residents of the shelter later revealed that Tatum had built relationships with several children. He would give them gifts, small things like candy, toys, or a bit of money. It was the classic grooming tactic of a predator, slowly breaking down barriers of suspicion, building trust in an environment where children had very little joy. For some parents, he offered a sense of relief, someone who would take the kids off their hands for a while. But for Relisha, his attention became deadly. When the police discovered that Tatum was now missing alongside Relisha, the case turned darker. The suspicion escalated into fear when just days later, the body of his wife, Andrea Tatum, was found inside a hotel room at the Oxon Hill Red Roof Inn in Prince George's County, Maryland. She had been shot in the head, execution style. Investigators concluded that Kahlil Tatum had killed her, perhaps to silence her, perhaps out of rage, or perhaps as part of a descent into violence that no one fully understood. The murder of Andrea Tatum made one fact brutally clear. This was not just a missing child case. This was a race against time with a dangerous killer at its center. The FBI joined the investigation, issuing a nationwide alert. The community mobilized with volunteers combing parks, rivers, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned wooded areas while detectives pored over surveillance tapes and phone records. Each new piece of information seemed to paint a more disturbing picture. Relisha's mother, Shamika, was questioned extensively. Why had she allowed her daughter to spend so much unsupervised time with Tatum? Why did she insist that Tatum was a doctor caring for Relisha when it was obvious he was not. Her answers shifted, sometimes defensive, sometimes evasive. Some speculated that Shamika was terrified of Tatum, while others accused her of negligence. What cannot be disputed is that the decisions made in those crucial weeks sealed Relisha's fate. The public grew angry. Talk shows and newspapers debated whether Shamika had knowingly put her daughter in harm's way. Some saw her as complicit. Others saw her as a victim of poverty and a broken system. Either way, the focus remained on finding Relisha before it was too late. On March 31, 2014, the search reached a devastating point. At Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, a vast stretch of marshland in northeast D.C., investigators discovered the lifeless body of Kahlil Tatum. He had died by suicide, a gunshot wound to the head. Nearby was a Bible, open, as though he had been reading it before pulling the trigger. The discovery answered one question, where Tatum had gone but left the most important one unresolved. Where was Relisha? Forensic teams scoured the area, hoping Tatum might have left some clue, some trace, a note, anything that would reveal what he had done with the little girl. But the park yielded no answers. Dogs sniffed through brush, divers searched waterways, and volunteers combed the terrain, but nothing was found. Relisha was not there. The suicide of Tatum marked a grim turning point. The man who had been the last to see Relisha alive was gone, and with him likely went the truth. Police were left with fragments of a puzzle, fragments that never quite fit together. Some investigators believed Tatum killed Relisha soon after the hotel sighting, perhaps even on March 1st, before his wife's murder. Others clinged to the possibility that he might have trafficked her, sold her into a network that preyed on vulnerable children. This theory gained traction when authorities revealed Tatum's known connections to criminal circles, including ties to human trafficking. That possibility that Relisha may have been handed over to predators remains one of the darkest aspects of the case. In the absence of a body, no one could rule it out. And so, in the years that followed, occasional tips would arise. A sighting of a girl who resembled her, whispers of someone matching her description. Each time, hope surged briefly, only to collapse when the lead evaporated. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case of Relisha Rudd slipped further into the realm of haunting mystery. The police continued to classify her as critically missing, a term used when a child's life is considered in immediate danger. But behind closed doors, many officers admitted privately that they believed Relisha was no longer alive. The public, however, refused to let her be forgotten. Vigils were held, with candles flickering in the night, parents holding their own children close as they prayed for answers. Community leaders spoke out against the failures that led to Relisha's disappearance, the shelter's lack of oversight, the city's slow response, and the broader issue of children growing up invisible in a system that was supposed to protect them. Relisha's face became a symbol. On missing child flyers, on posters attached to lampposts, on T-shirts worn by volunteers, her photograph reminded everyone of the innocence that had been stolen. Her case revealed a city divided between wealth and poverty, safety and danger, privilege and neglect. And at the heart of it all was one little girl who deserved so much more than the world had given her. By the end of 2014, the official investigation had slowed. Leads had dried up. The FBI, D.C. police, and child welfare agencies had done what they could, but without new information, the case went cold. Yet the unanswered questions remained like shadows over the city. What exactly happened inside that hotel on March 1st? Did Tatum kill her quickly? Or was there a more sinister plan? Did someone else help him? And why was a convicted criminal allowed to work in close proximity to vulnerable families in the first place? Every theory carried weight, but none carried proof. And in the silence left behind, speculation grew. Some claimed Relisha's mother knew more than she admitted. Others believed Relisha's disappearance was tied to larger trafficking networks. Some simply accepted the most painful possibility that Relisha's small body lies in some unmarked grave, her story forever unfinished. Segment 2 of the story ends with that chilling uncertainty. The suspect is dead. The trail has gone cold, and the city is left clinging to hope while fearing the worst. Relisha Rudd, just 8 years old, has become more than a missing child case. She has become a mirror, reflecting the failures of society, the cruelty of predators, and the fragility of childhood. The mystery deepens as we turn to the next chapter, where we examine the aftermath, the media storm, the community's outrage, and the haunting theories that continue to swirl around the disappearance of Relisha Rudd. The disappearance of Relisha Rudd was more than a missing child case. By the spring of 2014, it had become a story that rattled the entire city of Washington, D.C., and drew national headlines. Newspapers carried her face, television anchors spoke her name with urgency, and radio shows replayed the details of the case. Families housed there. The city's largest homeless shelter, meant to protect, had instead become the backdrop of a nightmare. As reporters dug deeper, the failures of the system became impossible to ignore. How could it be that a school's repeated concerns went unanswered for so long? Why had social workers not intervened earlier, when Relisha's absences stretched into weeks? And most disturbingly, how was a man with a violent criminal record given access to the very children the system was meant to safeguard? These questions grew louder as the public demanded accountability. City officials faced intense criticism. The mayor's office insisted that agencies had done all they could, pointing to the moment when Child and Family Services finally launched their investigation. But to many, this was far too late. Relisha had been missing from her school for more than a month before action was taken. A month, a span of time that, for a vulnerable child, can mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, the community was caught between grief and fury. Vigils were held across D.C., where candles glowed against the night sky and posters of Relisha's face were taped to walls and telephone poles. Parents held their own children tighter, reminded of how quickly safety can shatter. For those living in the same shelter where Relisha had vanished, the fear was more intimate. If it could happen to her, it could happen to any of their children. Theories began to swirl. With Tatum dead and no body found, speculation filled the silence. Some investigators leaned toward the belief that Tatum had killed Relisha shortly after she was last seen. The idea was brutal but simple. Relisha had become a victim of his violence just as his wife had. Perhaps her body lay in some unmarked grave hidden in the dense woods or murky waters of D.C., but despite extensive searches, nothing had ever been discovered. Others believed something darker. Tatum, they pointed out, had connections to the criminal underworld. He was known to associate with individuals involved in drugs, violence, and even trafficking. Could it be that he had handed Relisha over to such a network? This theory gained traction because, without a body, the possibility of trafficking lingered. It was an explanation that was horrifying but chillingly plausible, especially given how often vulnerable children are targeted by predators who see them as commodities. The trafficking theory took on more weight when investigators revealed that Tatum had purchased large quantities of supplies in the days after Relisha was last seen, things like garbage bags, lime, and other items that could either point to concealment of a body or preparation for something else. Forensic teams could not determine what these purchases meant, but they added to the mystery. Were these tools for hiding evidence, or for staging something more elaborate? For the public, each revelation brought more horror, and with each horror came more anger at the people who should have intervened. Much of that anger was directed at Relisha's mother, Shamika. Interviews with her were broadcast on television, and each time her demeanor stirred debate. Some viewers believed she was evasive, offering confusing statements about her daughter's whereabouts. Others thought she seemed more detached than expected of a mother whose child had vanished. Critics accused her of negligence, of choosing trust in Tatum over the safety of her own daughter. But others urged compassion. Shamika, they argued, was herself a product of systemic neglect. Living in poverty, raising multiple children in a shelter, surrounded by instability, her judgment had been shaped by desperation. Tatum had offered her children gifts and moments of escape, and in that fragile world, perhaps it felt like a small mercy rather than a danger. Still, the public's division over her role became another painful layer in the case. The debate over blame extended beyond Shamika. The city's agencies were put under a harsh spotlight. Child and Family Services insisted they had acted within protocol, yet critics pointed out that their intervention came only after the situation had already spiraled out of control. The school system, too, was scrutinized. Why did it take so long for absences to raise the alarm? Why weren't authorities contacted immediately when the excuse of Dr. Tatum was given? And above all, why was no one demanding proof of this supposed doctor's existence sooner? These failures gave the case an aura of inevitability, as though Relisha had been doomed long before March of 2014. She was born into a world where oversight was weak, where predators slipped through the cracks, and where the most vulnerable were left unprotected. Her disappearance became a symbol of what happens when society looks away too long. The media storm only intensified these feelings. Night after night, local stations covered the case, interviewing experts, dissecting timelines, and re-airing the haunting hotel footage that showed Relisha walking alongside Tatum for the last time. Viewers stared at that grainy video, analyzing her body language, searching for clues. Did she look afraid? Did she look trusting? Could anyone have known what was about to happen? In that silence, speculation turned to conspiracy. Some wondered if others at the shelter had known more than they admitted. Was Tatum working alone, or did he have help? The fact that no trace of Relisha was ever found fueled these suspicions. A single man covering his tracks could make mistakes, but an organized effort could erase her completely. As time passed, the case began to fade from the front pages, but it never disappeared entirely. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, vigils were held. Activists used her story to push for reform in D.C.'s homeless shelter system. Politicians invoked her name when discussing child welfare. And yet, despite all the attention, the central mystery remained untouched. Where was Relisha Rudd? In the absence of answers, her case began to echo other famous, unsolved disappearances. Like John Bennett Ramsey, she became a symbol of innocence lost and mystery unsolved. But unlike John Bennett, there was no crime scene preserved, no body to study, no evidence to dissect. There was only absence. Absence in the form of an 8-year-old girl who should have been in school, laughing with friends, dreaming of the future. The psychological weight of the case hung heavy on the city. Detectives who worked on it admitted it haunted them. For some, the image of Relisha's face was burned into their memories, a reminder of a case they could not solve. Community members spoke of feeling helpless, as though the city itself had swallowed her whole. Theories continued to grow in the years that followed. Some said Tatum had killed her and buried her body in a place no one had thought to look. Others clung to the hope, however faint, that she had been trafficked and was still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. The FBI kept her case open, her name on the list of critically missing, unwilling to declare her dead without proof. That small flicker of hope, though fragile, was enough for some to continue searching. Segment 3 of this story closes with those haunting theories, with the city caught between anger, grief, and unanswered questions. Relisha's disappearance is not just about one child. It is about a web of failures, a predator who thrived in plain sight, and a community left shattered. The truth lies buried somewhere in the silence, in the places where no one has looked, or perhaps in the mind of a man who took it with him to the grave. But the story does not end there. In the final chapter, we will explore the legacy of Relisha Rudd, the changes her case forced upon the city, the haunting reminders left behind, and the enduring mystery of a girl who walked into a hotel with a man and never walked out again. The disappearance of Relisha Rudd was not a case that simply faded into the background. It lingered. It haunted. Even as months turned into years, her absence continued to cast a shadow across Washington, D.C. The city may have returned to its routines, its noise, and its politics, but beneath the surface lay the memory of a girl who never came home. Relisha's story had become part of the city's conscience, a reminder of the cracks in its systems, and of the dangers that grow in those dark spaces where no one is watching. In the immediate aftermath of Kahlil Tatum's death, investigators were left with fragments of evidence, but no clear answers. They had no body, no confession, no proof of life, and no proof of death. And so the case remained suspended in an agonizing limbo. For her family, this meant that every phone call could spark hope. Every rumor could reopen wounds. For the police, it meant an open file that seemed destined to remain open forever. The FBI kept Relisha on its list of critically missing children. The classification mattered. It meant that her case would never be formally closed unless her body was found or she was confirmed alive. This kept resources tied to her disappearance and ensured that her name would continue to circulate in the databases of law enforcement agencies nationwide. Each year, the FBI reissued alerts with her age-progressed photos showing what Relisha might look like if she had survived. These digital portraits, created by forensic artists, carried a bittersweet weight. They allowed the public to imagine her growing older, but also reminded everyone that her real life had been interrupted at just 8 years old. The public, too, struggled with the uncertainty. For some, Relisha became a ghostly figure her face remembered, on missing child flyers, her name spoken during anniversaries, her story told at vigils. At Kenilworth Park, where Tatum ended his life, the ground itself seemed to hold unanswered questions. Search teams had scoured it, but the silence of that place remained deafening. Each year, when candles were lit and prayers were spoken, the park became more than a landscape. It became a symbol of the unknown. Community activists seized on her case as a call to action. They spoke of the need for stronger protections for children living in shelters, for stricter background checks on employees, and for faster responses from child services. Relisha's name became a rallying cry in the fight against systemic neglect. Parents who had once felt invisible now had a symbol to point to a reminder that ignoring the vulnerable can lead to catastrophe. But reform did not come easily. The shelter where Relisha once lived continued to operate, though under increased scrutiny. City officials promised changes, but residents often reported that conditions remained chaotic. With staff overwhelmed and families still living in unsafe circumstances. For those who had lost faith in the system, these promises sounded hollow. They believed the city had failed Relisha, and that no reform could erase that failure. The media's role in Relisha's story also carried a complicated legacy. In the first weeks after her disappearance, coverage was constant. Her face was everywhere. But as the months wore on, attention waned. Stories shifted to new headlines and new crises and new tragedies. For activists, this was another wound. They argued that if Relisha had been a white child from a wealthy family, the coverage would never have stopped. They pointed to the disparity in media attention between missing children of color and their white counterparts. Relisha's case became part of a larger conversation about missing white woman syndrome, a term used to describe the disproportionate focus given to certain victims while others are quietly forgotten. For those who refused to let her story fade, keeping Relisha's memory alive became a mission. Each March, community members gathered to honor her. They spoke her name, held signs with her photograph, and demanded justice. In schools, teachers used her story as a lesson not only about safety, but about compassion, about recognizing the unseen struggles of children living in poverty. Yet for all the vigils, the marches, and the prayers, the question remained the same. Where was she? Theories continued to swirl, and each carried its own torment. Some believed firmly that Tatum had killed her. They pointed to the evidence, his purchases of lime and garbage bags, his violent history, the murder of his wife. To them, the answer was tragic, but clear Relisha was gone, her body hidden in a place that may never be found. Others, however, clung to the possibility that she had been trafficked. This theory, though horrifying, offered a sliver of hope, that perhaps she was still alive somewhere, though living a life no child should ever endure. The trafficking theory kept the FBI engaged. Agents followed tips across state lines, chasing reports of sightings in strip malls, bus stations, and truck stops. Each time, the possibility of finding her alive reignited hope. But each time, the leads collapsed into disappointment. Her mother's role remained a subject of bitter debate. Some accused Shamika of complicity, arguing that she had effectively handed her daughter to a predator. Others insisted that she was a victim herself, trapped in a cycle of poverty, manipulated by a man who appeared helpful. Shamika gave interviews, sometimes emotional, sometimes defensive, but never providing the answers the public longed for. Her life, like her daughter's case, became defined by suspicion and judgment. For Relisha's siblings, the loss was deeply personal. They had lived alongside her in the shelter, shared in the small joys and struggles of that fragile world. When Relisha disappeared, their family unit fractured. They became part of a story too large for any child to carry. Their memories of her were precious, but they were also painful reminders of what had been stolen. The haunting nature of Relisha's case lies not only in her disappearance, but in what it represents. She was a child born into invisibility, growing up in a shelter few wanted to see, disappearing in circumstances no one should endure. Her story forced the city and the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, neglect, and the predators who exploit them. It revealed a system stretched too thin, where warnings are overlooked until it is too late. Years later, Relisha's case remains unsolved. Age-progressed images continue to circulate, showing what she might look like as a teenager, then as a young adult. Each image is a cruel reminder of time passing without her. Each photo represents birthdays missed, milestones uncelebrated, and a childhood erased. Detectives who once worked the case admit it is one that haunts them the most. They replay the evidence in their minds, searching for the detail they might have missed. They visit the places where she might have been taken, wondering if the answers lie just beyond reach. Some believe the truth may never be known, that Relisha's story will remain an open wound forever. Others cling to the idea that someday, someone will come forward with the missing piece of information. The legacy of Relisha Rudd is not just in the unanswered questions, but in the lessons her story demands. It is a lesson about vigilance, about refusing to overlook the vulnerable. It is about the need for systems that truly protect, not just in policy but in practice. And it is about the cruel reality that sometimes evil hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of a helper until it is too late. As this story closes, we are left with the image of an 8-year-old girl walking into a hotel alongside a man who should never have been near her. That grainy footage is the last proof of her existence, a frozen moment in time where innocence met darkness. From that door, she never emerged. From that day, she was never seen again. And so the city remains haunted. Her name whispered in vigils, her face carried on posters, her story etched into the memory of all who know it. Relisha Rudd, the little girl who vanished not just from her family, but from the world's protection, remains an unsolved mystery, a question without an answer, a child whose story demands that we never forget. Because to forget her is to accept the silence, and the silence in her case is unbearable. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share